Now he was left alone, broken in health, dashed in spirit, consenting to live, wishing to live for Elizabeth's sake, yet haunted still by one pale ghost, and the knowledge that his bosom contained a secret which, if divulged, would acquire for him universal detestation. He did not fear discovery, but little do they know the human heart who are not aware of the throes of shame and anguish that attend the knowledge that we are in reality a cheat, that we disguise our own real selves, and that truth is our worst enemy. Left to himself, Falkner thought of these things with bitterness. He loathed the burden that sat upon his soul. He longed to cast it off. Yet when he thought of Elizabeth, her devoted affection and earnest entreaties, he was again a coward. How could he consent to give her up and plant a dagger in her heart? There was but one cure to the irritation that his spirit endured, which was to take refuge in her society, and he was about to join her when a letter came, speaking of Gerard Neville, the same wild boy they had seen at Baden, the kind friend of Marseille, still melancholy, still stricken by adversity, but endowed with 1,000 qualities to attract love and admiration, full of sentiment and poetry, kind and tender as woman, resolute and independent as a man. Elizabeth said little, remembering Falkner's previous restriction upon his name, but she considered it her duty to mention him to her benefactor, and that being her duty to him, it became another to her new friend to assert his excellence, lest by some chance Falkner had mistaken and attributed qualities that did not belong to him. Falkner's thoughts became busy on this with new ideas. It was at once pleasing and painful to hear of the virtues of Gerard Neville. The pleasure was derived from the better portion of human nature, the pain from the worst, a lurking envy and dislike to excellence derived in any degree from one he hated, and with such sentiment he regarded the father of Gerard. Still he was the son of the angel he worshipped and had destroyed. She had loved her child to adoration, and to know that he grew up all she would have wished would console her wandering, unappeased spirit. He remembered his likeness to her, and that softened him even more. Yet he thought of the past and what he had done, and the very idea of her son lamenting forever his lost mother filled him with renewed and racking remorse. That Elizabeth should now for the third time be thrown in his way was strange, and his first impulse was to recall her. It was well that Gerard should be noble-minded, endowed with talent, a rare and exalted being, but that she should be brought into near contact with him was evil. Between Falkner and Gerard Neville there existed a gulf unfathomable, horrific, deadly, and any friendship between him and his adopted child must cause disunion between her and Falkner. He had suffered much, but this last blow, a cause for disuniting them, would tax his fortitude too much. Yet thus it was to be taxed. He received a letter from Lady Cecil, of which Elizabeth was ignorant. Its ostensible object was to give good tidings of her fair guest's health and to renew her invitation to him, but there was a covert meaning which Falkner detected. Lady Cecil, though too young to be an inveterate matchmaker, yet conceived and cherished the idea of the marriage of Neville and Elizabeth. In common parlance, Gerard might look higher, but so also might Elizabeth, apparently the only daughter and heiress of a man of good birth and easy fortune. But this went for little with Lady Cecil. Gerard's peculiar disposition, his devotion to his dead mother, his distaste to all society, the coldness he had hitherto manifested to feminine attractions, made the choice of a wife difficult for him. Elizabeth's heroic and congenial character, her total inexperience in the world, and readiness to sympathize with sentiments which, to the ordinary class of women, would appear extravagant and foolish. All this suited them for each other. Lady Cecil saw them together and felt that intimacy would produce love. She was delighted, but thinking it right that the father should have a voice, she wrote to Falkner, scarcely alluding to these things, but with a delicate tact that enabled her to convey her meaning, and Falkner, jumping at once to the conclusion, saw that his child was lost to him forever. There arose from this idea a convulsion of feeling that shook him as an earthquake shakes the firm land, making the most stable edifices totter. A chill horror ran through his veins, a cold dew broke out on his forehead. It was unnatural, it was fatal, it must bring on all their heads tenfold ruin. Yet wherefore? Elizabeth was no child of his. Elizabeth Falkner could never wed Gerard Neville, But between him and Elizabeth Raby there existed no obstacle. Nay, how better could he repay the injury he had done him in depriving him of his mother, than by bestowing on him a creature, perhaps more perfect, to be his solace and delight to the end of his life. So must it be, here Falkner's punishment would begin, to exile himself forever from her, who was the child of his heart, the prop of his existence. It was dreadful to think of, but it must be done. And how was the sacrifice to be fulfilled? By restoring Elizabeth to her father's family and then withdrawing himself to a distant land. He need not add to this the confession of his crime. No, thus should he compensate to Gerard for the injury done him, and burning his papers, leaving still in mystery the unknown past, die, without its ever being known to Elizabeth that he was the cause of her husband's sorrows. It was traveling fast to arrange this future for all three, but there are moments when the future, with all its contingencies and possibilities, becomes glaringly distinct to our foreseeing eye, and we act as if that was which we believe must be. He would become a soldier once again, and the boon of death would not be forever denied to him. To restore Elizabeth to her family was at any rate but doing her a long-withheld justice. The child of honor and faithful affection, who bore a proud name, whose loveliness of person and mind would make her a welcome treasure in any family. She, despite her generous sacrifices, should follow his broken fortunes no longer. If the notion of her marrying Neville were a mere dream, still to give back to her name and station was a benefit which it was unjust any longer to withhold, nor should it be a question between them. They were now divided, so should they remain. He would reveal her existence to her family, claim their protection, and then withdraw himself, while she, occupied by a new and engrossing sentiment, would easily get reconciled to his absence. The first step he took in furtherance of this new resolution was to make inquiries concerning the present state of Elizabeth's family, of which hitherto he knew no more than what he gathered from her mother's unfinished letter, and this was limited to their being a wealthy Catholic family, proud of their ancestry and devoted to their faith. Through his solicitor, he gained intelligence of their exact situation. He heard that there was a family of that name in Northumberland. It was Roman Catholic and exceedingly rich. The present head of the family was an old man. He had long been a widower, left with a family of 6 sons. The eldest had married early and was dead, leaving his widow with 4 daughters and 1 son, yet a child, who was the heir of the family honors and estates, and resided with his mother, for the most part, at the mansion of his grandfather. Of the remaining sons little account could be gained. It was the family custom to concentrate all its prosperity and wealth on the head of the eldest son, and the younger, precluded by their religion at that time from advancement in their own country, entered foreign service. One only had exempted himself from the common lot and become an outcast, and in the eyes of his family a reprobate. Edwin Raby had apostatized from the Catholic faith. He had married a portionless girl of inferior birth and entered the profession of the law. His parents looked with indignation on the dishonor entailed on their name through his falling off, but his death relieved their terrors. He died, leaving a widow and an infant daughter. As the marriage had never been acknowledged, and female offspring were held supernumerary and an encumbrance in the Raby family, they had refused to receive her and never heard of her more. She was, it was conjectured, living in obscurity among her own relations. Falkner at once detected the truth. The despised, deserted widow had died in her youth, and the daughter of Edwin Raby was the child of his adoption. On this information, Falkner regulated his conduct, and finding that Elizabeth's grandfather, old Oswy Raby, resided habitually at his seat in the north of England, his health now restored sufficiently to make the journey without inconvenience, set out for Northumberland to communicate the existence and claim his acknowledgement of his granddaughter. There are periods in our lives when we seem to run away from ourselves and our afflictions to commence a new course of existence upon fresh ground towards a happier goal. Sometimes, on the contrary, the stream of life doubles, runs back to old scenes, and we are constrained to linger amid the desolation we had hoped to leave far behind. Thus was it with Falkner. The past clung to him inextricably. What had he to do with those who had suffered through his misdeed? He had fled from them, he had traversed a quarter of the earth, he had placed a series of years between them. But there he was again, in the same spot, the same forms before him, the same name sounding in his ears, the effects of his actions impending darkly and portentously over him, seeing no escape but by casting away the only treasure of his life, his adopted child, and becoming again a solitary, miserable wanderer. No man ever suffered more keenly than Falkner the stings of remorse. No man ever resolved more firmly to meet the consequences of his actions systematically and without outward flinching. It was perseverance to one goal that had occasioned all his sin and woe. It followed him in his repentance, and though misery set a visible mark on his brow, he did not hesitate nor delay. The journey to Northumberland was long, for he could only proceed by short stages, and all the time miserable reflection doubled every mile and stretched each hour into twice its duration. He was alone. To look back was wretchedness, to think of Elizabeth was no solace. Hereafter they were to be divided. Hereafter no voice of love or gentle caress would chase the darkness from his brow. He was to be forever alone. At length he arrived at his destination and reached the entrance to Belleforest. The mansion, a fine old Gothic building adorned by the ruins of an ancient abbey, was in itself venerable and extensive, and surrounded by a princely domain. This was the residence of Elizabeth's ancestors, of her nearest relations. Here her childhood would have been spent, under these venerable oaks, within these ancestral walls. Falkner was glad to think that, in being forced to withdraw from her his own protection, she would take a higher station, and in the world's eye become more on an equality with Gerard Neville. Everything around denoted grandeur and wealth, the very circumstance that the family adhered to the ancient faith of the land, to a form of worship which, though evil in its effects on the human mind, is to the eye imposing and magnificent, shed a greater luster round. The place, on inquiry, Falkner heard that the old gentleman was at Belleforest. Indeed, he never quitted it, but that his daughter-in-law, with her family, were in the south of England. Mr. Raby was very accessible. On asking for him, Falkner was instantly ushered in. He entered a library of vast dimensions and fitted up with a sort of heavy splendor, very imposing but very somber. The high windows, painted ceiling, and massy furniture bespoke an old-fashioned but almost regal taste. Falkner for a moment thought himself alone, when a slight noise attracted his attention to a diminutive and very white old gentleman who advanced towards him. The mansion looked built for a giant race, and Falkner, expecting the majesty of size, could hardly contract his view to the slender and insignificant figure of the present possessor. Oswy Raby looked shriveled, not so much by age as the narrowness of his mind, to whose dimensions his outward figure had contracted itself. His face was pale and thin, his light blue eyes grown dim. You might have thought that he was drying up and vanishing from the earth by degrees. Contrasted with this slight shadow of a man was a mind that saw the whole world almost concentrated in himself. He, Oswy Raby, he head of the oldest family in England, was first of created beings. Without being assuming in manner, he was self-important in heart, and there was an obstinacy and an incapacity to understand that anything was of consequence except himself, or rather, except the house he represented, that gave extreme repulsion to his manners. It is always awkward to disclose an errand such as Falkner's. It was only by plunging at once into it, and warming himself by his own words, that he contrived to throw grace round his subject. A cloud gathered over the old man's features. He grew whiter, and his thin lips closed, as if they had never opened except with a refusal. "You speak of very painful circumstances," he said. "I have sometimes feared that I should be intruded upon in behalf of this person, yet, after so many years, there is less pretense than ever for encroaching upon an injured family." Edwin himself broke the tie. He was rebellious and apostate. He had talents and might have distinguished himself to his honor. He preferred irreparable disgrace. He abandoned the religion which we consider as the most precious part of our inheritance, and he added imprudence to guilt by, he being himself unprovided for, marrying a portionless, low-born girl. He never hoped for my forgiveness, he never even asked it. His death, it is hard for a father to feel thus, but his death was a relief. We were applied to by his widow, but with her we could have nothing to do. She was the partner of his rebellion, nay, we looked upon her as its primal cause. I was willing to take charge of my grandchild, if delivered entirely up to me. She did not even think proper to reply to the letter making this concession. I had, indeed, come to the determination of continuing to her a portion of the allowance I made to my son, despite his disobedience. But from that time to this, no tidings of either mother or daughter have reached us. Death must bear the blame of that negligence, said Falkner, mastering his rising disgust. Mrs. Raby was hurried to the grave but a few months after your son's death, the victim of her devoted affection to her husband. Their innocent daughter was left among strangers who did not know to whom to apply. She, at least, is free from all fault and has every claim on her father's family. She is nothing and has no claim, interrupted Mr. Raby peevishly, beyond a bare maintenance, even if she be the person you represent. I beg your pardon, sir, but you may be deceived yourself on this subject. But taking it for granted that this young person is the daughter of my son, what is she to me? A granddaughter is a relation, Falkner began, a near and dear one. Under such circumstances, interrupted Mr. Raby, under the circumstances of a marriage to which I gave no consent, and her being brought up at a distance from us all, I should rather call her a connection than a relation. We cannot look with favor on the child of an apostate, educated in a faith which we consider pernicious. I am an old-fashioned man, accustomed only to the society of those whose feelings coincide with mine, and I must apologize, sir, if I say anything to shock you, but the truth is self-evident. A child of a discarded son may have a slender claim for support, none for favor or countenance. This young person has no right to raise her eyes to us. She must regulate her expectations by the condition of her mother, who was a sort of servant, a humble companion or governess, in the house of Mrs. Neville of Dramore. Falkner grew pale at the name, but commanding himself replied, I believe she was a friend of that lady. I have said I was unacquainted with the parents of Miss Raby. I found her an orphan, subsisting on precarious charity. Her few years, her forlorn situation, her beauty and sweetness, claimed my compassion. I adopted her. And would now throw her off, again interrupted the ill-tempered old man. Had you restored her to us in her childhood, had she been brought up in our religion among us, she would have shared this home with her cousins. As it is, you must yourself be aware that it will be impossible to admit, as an inmate, a stranger, a person ignorant of our peculiar systems, an alien from our religion. Mrs. Raby would never consent to it, and I would on no account annoy her who, as the mother and guardian of my heir, merits every deference. I will, however, consult with her, and with the gentleman who has the conduct of my affairs. And as you wish to get rid of an embarrassment, which, pardon me if I say you entirely brought on yourself, we will do what we judge due to the honor of the family, but I cannot hold out any hopes beyond a maintenance, unless this young person, whom I should then regard as my granddaughter, felt a vocation for a religion, out of whose pale I will never acknowledge a relation. At every word Falkner grew more angry. He always repressed any manifestation of passion, and only grew pale and spoke in a lower, calmer voice. There was a pause. He glanced at the white hair and attenuated form of the old man, so to acquire a sufficient portion of forbearance, and then replied, It is enough. Forget this visit. You shall never hear again of the existence of your outraged grandchild. Could you for a moment comprehend her worth, you might feel regret at casting from you one whose qualities render her the admiration of all who know her. Some day, when the infirmities of age increase upon you, you may remember that you might have had a being near, the most compassionate and kind that breathes. If ever you feel the want of an affectionate hand to smooth your pillow, you may remember that you have shut your heart to one who would have been a daily blessing. I do not wish to disembarrass myself of Miss Raby, Miss Falkner, rather, let me call her. She has borne my name as my daughter for many years, and shall continue to retain it, together with my paternal guardianship, while I live. I have the honor to wish you a good morning. Falkner hastily departed, and as he threw himself on his horse, and at a quick pace traversed the long avenues of Belleforest, he felt that boiling of the blood, that inexpressible bursting and tumult of the heart, that accompanies fierce indignation and disdain. A vehement desire to pour out the cataract of his contempt and anger on the offender was mingled with redoubled tenderness for Elizabeth, with renewed gratitude for all he owed her, and a yearning, heart-warming desire to take her again to the shelter of his love, from whence she should never more depart. Chapter 24. Falkner's mind had undergone a total change. He had gone to Belleforest, believing it to be his duty to restore to its possessors a dearer treasure than any held by them. He left it, resolved never to part from his adopted child. Get rid of an embarrassment, he repeated to himself, get rid of Elizabeth, of tender affection, truth, and fidelity, of the heart's fondest ties, my soul's only solace. How often has my life been saved and cheered by her only? And when I would sacrifice blessings of which I hold myself unworthy, I hear the noblest and most generous being in the world degraded by the vulgar, sordid prejudices of that narrow-minded bigot. How paltry seems the pomp of wealth, or the majesty of these ancient woods, when it is recollected that they are lorded over by such a thing as that. Falkner's reflections were all painful. His heavily burdened conscience weighed him to the earth. He felt that there was justice in a part of Mr. Raby's representations, that if Elizabeth had been brought up under his care, in a religion which, because it was persecuted, was the more valuable in their eyes, participating in their prejudices, and endeared to them by habit, she would have had claims, which, as she was, unseen, unknown, and totally disjoined from them in opinions and feelings she could never possess. He was the cause of this, having, in her infancy, chosen to take her to himself, to link his desolate fate to her brighter one. And now he could only repent for her sake. Yet for her sake he did repent, when, looking forward, he thought of the growing attachment between her and the son of his victim. What could he do? Recall her? Forbid her again to see Gerard Neville? Unexplained commands are ever unjust, and had any strong feeling sprung up in either of their hearts, they could not be obeyed. Should he tell her all and throw himself on her mercy, he would thus inflict deep, irreparable pangs, and besides, place her in a painful situation, where duty would struggle with inclination, and pride and affection both made it detestable to him to create such a combat in her heart, and cause her to feel pangs and make sacrifices for him. What other part was there to take? To remain neuter, let events take their course. If it ended as he foresaw, when a marriage was mentioned, he could reveal her real birth. Married to Gerard Neville, her relations would gladly acknowledge her, and then he could withdraw forever. He should have much to endure meanwhile, to hear a name perpetually repeated that thrilled to the very marrow of his bones, perhaps to see the husband and son of her he had destroyed. He felt sick at heart at such a thought. He put it aside. It was not today, it could not be tomorrow, that he should be called upon to encounter these evils. Meanwhile, he would shut his eyes upon them. Returning homeward, he felt impelled to prolong his tour. He visited some of the lakes of Westmoreland and the mountain scenery of Derbyshire. The thought of return was painful, so he lingered on the way and wrote for his letters to be forwarded to him. He had been some weeks without receiving any from Elizabeth, and he felt extreme impatience again to be blessed with the sight of her handwriting. He felt how passionately he loved her. How to part from her was to part from every joy of life. He called himself her father, his heart acknowledged the tie in every pulsation. No father ever worshipped a child so fervently. Her voice, her smile, and dear loving eyes, where were they? They were far, but here was something, a little packet of letters, that must for the present stand in lieu of the dearer blessing of her presence. He looked at the papers with delight. He pressed them to his lips. He delayed to open them, as if he did not deserve the joy they would communicate, as if its excess would overpower him. I purpose parting from her, he thought, but still she is mine, mine when she traced those lines, mine as I read the expressions of her affection. There are hours of delight garnered for me in those little sealed talismans that nothing future or past can tarnish, and yet the name of Neville will be there. The thought brought a cold chill with it, and he opened the letters hastily to know the worst. Elizabeth had half forgotten the pain with which Falkner had at one time shrunk from a name become so dear to her. When she wrote, her heart was full of Gerard's story, and besides, she had had letters from her father speaking of him with kindness, so that she indulged herself by alluding to it, to the disappearance of his mother and Gerard's misery, the trial, the brutality of Sir Boyville, and last, to the resolution formed in childhood, brooded over through youth, now acted upon, to discover his mother's destroyer. Nor is it, she wrote, any vulgar feeling of vengeance that influences him, but the purest and noblest motives. She is stigmatized as unworthy, he would vindicate her fame. When I hear the surmises, the accusations cast on her, I feel with him. To hear a beloved parent accused of guilt must indeed be the most bitter woe. To believe her innocent, and to prove her such, the only alleviation. God grant that he may succeed. And though I wish no ill to any human being, yet rather may the height of evil fall on the head of the true criminal than continue to cloud the days of a being whose soul is molded in sensibility and honor. Thus do you pray, heedless Elizabeth, may the true criminal feel the height of evil, may he, whom you have saved from death, endure tortures compared to which 1,000 deaths were nothing. Be it so, you shall have your wish. Impetuous as fire, Falkner did not pause. Some emotion devouring as fire, was lighted up in his heart. There must be no delay. Never had he seen the effects of his crime in so vivid a light. Avoiding the name of Neville, he had never heard that of his victim coupled with shame. She was unfortunate, but he persuaded himself that she was not thought guilty. Dear injured saint. Had then her sacred name been bandied about by the vulgar, she pronounced unworthy by the judges of her acts, ignominy heaped upon the grave he had dug for her? Was her beloved son the victim of his belief in her goodness? Had his youthful life been blighted by his cowardly concealments? Oh, rather 1,000 deaths than such a weight of sin upon his soul. He would declare all, offer his life in expiation. What more could be demanded? And again, this might be thought a more sordid motive, and yet it was not. Gerard was vowed to the discovery of the true criminal. He would discover him, earth would render up her secrets, heaven lead the sun to the very point. By slow degrees his crime would be unveiled, Elizabeth called upon to doubt and to believe. His vehement disposition was not calculated to bear the slow process of such discoveries. He would meet them, avow all, let the worst fall on him. It was happiness to know and feel the worst. Lost forever, he would deliver himself up to reprobation and the punishment of his guilt. Too long he had delayed. Now all his motives for concealment melted away like snow overspread by volcanic fire. Fierce, hurrying destiny seized him by the hair of his head, crying aloud, "Murderer, offer up thy blood, shade of Alitha, take thy victim." He wrote instantly to Elizabeth to meet him at their home at Wimbledon and proceeded thither himself. Unfortunately, the tumult of his thoughts acted on his health. After he had proceeded a few miles, he was taken ill. For 3 days he was confined to his bed, in a high fever. He thought he was about to die, his secret untold. Copious bleeding, however, subdued the violence of the attack, and weak and faint, he, despite his physician's advice, proceeded homeward. Weak and faint, an altered man, life had no charms, no calls, but one duty. Hitherto he had lived in contempt of the chain of effects, which ever links pain to evil, and of the providence which will not let the innocent be forever traduced. It had fallen on him. Now his punishment had begun, not as he, in the happier vehemence of passion, had determined, not by sudden, self-inflicted, or glorious death, but the slow grinding of the iron wheels of destiny as they passed over him, crushing him in the dust. Yet his heart, despite its sufferings, warmed with something like pleasure when, after a tedious journey of 3 days, he drew near his home, where he hoped to find Elizabeth. He had misgivings. He had asked her to return, but she might have written to request a delay. No, she was there. She had been there 2 days, anxiously expecting him. It is so sweet a thing to hear the voice of one we love welcoming us on our return home. It seems to assure us of a double existence, not only in our own identity, which we bear perpetually about with us, but in the heart we leave behind, which has thought of us, lived for us, and now beats with warm pleasure on beholding the expected one. On the whole earth, Falkner loved none but Elizabeth. He hated himself, the past, the present, the future as they appertained to him were all detestable. Remorse, grief, and loathsome anticipation made up the sum of feelings with which he regarded them. But here, bright and beautiful, without taint, all affection and innocence, a monument of his own good feelings, a lasting rock to which to moor his every hope, stood before him the child of his adoption. His heart felt bursting when he thought of all she was to him. Yet a doubt entered to mar his satisfaction. Was she changed? If love had insinuated itself into her heart, he was rejected. At least the plenteous, abundant fountain that gave from its own source would be changed to the still waters that neither received increase nor bestowed any overflowing. Worse than this, she loved Gerard Neville, the son of his victim, he whose life was devastated by him, who would regard him with abhorrence. He would teach Elizabeth to partake this feeling. The blood stood chilled in Falkner's heart when he thought of thus losing the only being he loved on earth. He mastered these feelings when he saw her. The first moment, indeed, when she flew to his arms and expressed with eager fondness her delight in seeing him again, was all happiness. She perceived the traces of suffering on his brow and chided herself for having remained away so long. She promised never to absent herself thus again. Every remembered look and tone of her dear face and voice, now brought palpably before him, was a medicine to Falkner. He repressed his uneasiness, he banished his fears. For a few hours he made happiness his own again. The evening was passed in calm and cheering conversation. No word was said of the friends whom Elizabeth had left. She had forgotten them during the first few hours she spent with her father, and when she did allude to her visit, Falkner said, "We will talk of these things tomorrow. Tonight let us only think of ourselves." Elizabeth felt a little mortified. The past weeks, the fortunes of her friends, and the sentiments they excited had become a part of herself, and she was pained that so much of disjunction existed between her and Falkner as to make that which was so vivid and present to her vacant of interest to him. But she checked her disappointment. Soon he would know her new friend, sympathize in his devotion towards his injured mother, enter as warmly as she did into the result of his endeavors for her exculpation. Meanwhile she yielded to his wish, and they talked of scenes and countries they had visited together, and all the feelings and opinions engendered by the past, as they were wont to do in days gone by, before a stranger influence had disturbed a world in which they lived for each other only, father and daughter, without an interest beyond. Nothing could be more pure and entire than their affection, and there was between them that mingling of hearts which words cannot describe, but which, whenever it is experienced, in whatever relation in life, is unalloyed happiness. There was a total absence of disguise, of covert censure, of mutual diffidence. Perfect confidence gave rise to the fearless utterance of every idea, and there was a repose, and yet an enjoyment in the sense of sympathy and truth, which filled and satisfied. Falkner was surprised at the balmy sense of joy that, despite everything, stole over him, and he kissed and blessed his child, as she retired for the night, with more grateful affection, a fuller sense of her merits, and a more fervent desire of preserving her always near him than he had ever before been conscious of experiencing. Chapter 25. Elizabeth rose on the following morning, her bosom glowing with a sensation of acknowledged happiness. So much of young love brooded in her heart, as quickened its pulsations, as gave lightness and joy to her thoughts. She had no doubts, nor fears, nor even hopes. She was not aware that love was the real cause of the grateful sense of happiness, with which she avowed to heaven and herself that all was peace. She was glad to be reunited to Falkner, for whom she felt an attachment at once so respectful, and yet, on account of his illness and melancholy, so watchful and tender, as never allowed her to be wholly free from solicitude when absent from him. Also she expected on that morning to see Gerard Neville. When Falkner's letter came to hasten her departure from Oakley, she felt grieved at the recall, at the moment when she was expecting him to join her, so to fill up the measure of her enjoyments. With all this, she was eager to obey, and anxious to be with him again. Lady Cecil deputed Miss Jervis to accompany her. On the very morning of their departure, Neville asked for a seat in the carriage. They travelled to town together, and when they separated, Neville told her of his intention of immediately securing a passage to America, and since then had written a note to mention that he should ride over to Wimbledon on that morning. The deep interest that Elizabeth took in his enterprise made her solicitous to know whether he had procured any further information, but her paramount desire was to introduce him to Falkner, to inspire him with her sentiments of friendship, and to see two persons whom she considered superior to the rest of the world bound to each other by a mutual attachment. She wanted to impart to her father a pity for Alitha's wrongs and an admiration for her devoted son. She walked in the shrubbery before breakfast, enjoying nature with the enthusiasm of love. She gathered the last roses of the departing season, and mingling them with a few carnations, hung, with a new sense of rapture, over these fairest children of nature. For it is the property of love to enhance all our enjoyments, to paint the lily, and add a perfume to the rose. When she returned to the house, She was told that Falkner still slept, and begged not to be disturbed. She breakfasted, therefore, by herself, sitting by the open casement and looking on the waving trees, her flowers shedding a sweet atmosphere around, sometimes turning to her open book, where she read of the heavenly Una with her milk-white lamb, and sometimes leaning her cheek upon her hand, in one of those reveries where we rather feel than think, and every articulation of the frame thrills with a living bliss. The quick canter of a horse, the stopping at the gate, the ringing of the bell, and the entrance of Neville made her heart beat and her eyes light up with gladness. He entered with a lighter step, a more cheerful and animated mien than usual. He was aware that he loved. He was assured that Elizabeth was the being selected from the whole world who could make him happy, while he regarded her with all the admiration, the worship, due to her virtues. He had never loved before. The gloom that absorbed him, the shyness inspired by his extreme sensitiveness, had hitherto made him avoid the society of women. Their pleasures, their gaiety, their light, airy converse were a blank to him. It was Elizabeth's sufferings that first led him to remark her, the clearness of her understanding, her simplicity, tenderness, and dignity of soul won him. And lastly, the unbounded, undisguised sympathy she felt for his endeavors, which all else regarded as futile and insane, riveted him to her indissolubly. Events were about to separate them, but her thoughts would accompany him across the Atlantic, stand suspended while his success was dubious, and hail his triumph with a joy equal to his own. The very thought gave fresh ardor to his desire to fulfill his task. He had no doubt of success, and though the idea of his mother's fate was still a cloud in the prospect, it only mellowed, without defacing the glowing tints shed over it by love. They met with undisguised pleasure. He sat near her and gazed with such delight as, to one less inexperienced than Elizabeth, would have at once betrayed the secret of his heart. He told her that he had found a vessel about to sail for New York, and that he had engaged a passage on board. He was restless and uneasy. He feared 1,000 chances. He felt as if he were neglecting his most sacred duty by any delay. There was something in him urging him on, telling him that the crisis was at hand, and yet that any neglect on his part might cause the moment to slip by forever. When arrived at New York, he should proceed with all speed to Washington, and then, if Osborne had not arrived, he should set forward to meet him. So much might intervene to balk his hopes. Osborne might die, and his secret die with him. Every moment's delay was crime. The vessel was to drop down the river that very night, and tomorrow he was to join her at Sheerness. He had come to say farewell. This sudden departure led to 1,000 topics of interest, to his hopes, his certainty that all would soon be revealed, and he rewarded for his long suffering. Such ideas led him to speak of the virtues of his mother, which were the foundation of his hopes. He spoke of her as he remembered her. He described her watchful tenderness, her playful but well-regulated treatment of himself. Still in his dreams, he said, he sometimes felt pressed in her arms and kissed with all the passionate affection of her maternal heart. In such sweet visions, her cry of agony would mingle. It seemed the last shriek of woe and death. "Can you wonder," continued Neville, "can my father, can Sophia wonder, that recollecting all these things, I will not bear without a struggle that my mother's name should be clouded, her fate encompassed by mystery and blame, her very warm, kind feelings and enchanting sensibility turned into accusations against her. I do indeed hope and believe that I shall learn the truth whither I am going, and that the unfortunate victim of lawless violence, of whom Osborne spoke, is my lost mother. But if I am disappointed in this expectation, I shall not for that give up my pursuit. It will only whet my purpose to seek the truth elsewhere." "And that truth may be less sad than you anticipate," said Elizabeth. "Yet I cannot help fearing that the miserable tragedy which you have heard is connected with your mother's fate." "That it is a tragedy may well dash my eagerness," replied Neville. "For right or wrong, I cannot help feeling that to see her again, to console her for her sufferings, to show that she is remembered, loved, idolized by her son, would be a dearer reward to me than triumph over the barbarous condemnation of the world, if that triumph is to be purchased by having lost her forever. This is not an heroic feeling, I confess." "If it be heroism," said Elizabeth, "to find our chief good in serving others, if compassion, sympathy, and generosity be greater virtues, as I believe, than cold, self-absorbed severity, then is your feeling founded on the purest portion of our nature." While they were thus talking, seated near each other, Elizabeth's face beaming with celestial benignity, and Neville, in the warmth of his gratitude for her approval, had taken her hand and pressed it to his lips, the door opened, and Falkner slowly entered. He had not heard of the arrival of the stranger, but seeing a guest with Elizabeth, he divined in a moment who it was. The thought ran through his frame like an ice bolt. His knees trembled under him, cold dew gathered on his brow. For a moment he leaned against the doorway, unable to support himself, while Elizabeth, perceiving his entrance, blushing, she knew not why, and now frightened by the ghastly pallor of his face, started up, exclaiming, "My father, are you ill?" Falkner struggled a moment longer, and then recovered his self-possession. The disordered expression of his countenance was replaced by a cold and stern look, which, aided by the marble paleness that settled over it, looked more like the chiseling of a statue than mortal endurance. A lofty resolve to bear unflinchingly was the spirit that molded his features into an appearance of calm. From this moment he acquired the strength of body, as well as of mind, to meet the destiny before him. The energy of his soul did not again fail. Every instant, every word seemed to add to his courage, to nerve him to the utmost height of endurance, to make him ready to leap, without one tremor, into the abyss which he had so long and so fearfully avoided. The likeness of Neville to his mother had shaken him more than all. His voice, whose tones were the same with hers, was another shock. His very name jarred upon his sense, but he betrayed no token of suffering. "Mr. Neville," said Elizabeth, "is come to take leave of me. Tomorrow he sails to America." "To America, wherefore?" asked Falkner. "I wrote to you," she replied. "I explained the motives of this voyage, you know." "I know all," said Falkner, "and this voyage to America is superfluous." Neville echoed the word with surprise, while Elizabeth exclaimed, "Do you think so? You must have good reasons for this opinion. Tell them to Mr. Neville. Your counsels, I am sure, will be of use to him. I have often wished that you had been with us. I am so glad that he sees you before he goes, if he does go. You say his voyage is superfluous. Tell him wherefore, advise him. Your advice will, I am sure, be good. I would give the world that he did the exact thing that is best, that is most likely to succeed." Neville looked gratefully at her as she spoke thus eagerly, while Falkner, still standing, his eyes fixed on and scanning the person of the son of his victim, marble pale, but displaying feeling by no other outward sign, scarcely heard what she said, till her last words drew his attention. He smiled as in scorn and said, "Oh, yes, I can advise, and he shall succeed, and he will not go." "I shall be happy," said Neville with surprise. "I am willing to be advised, that is, if your advice coincides with my wishes." "It shall do so," interrupted Falkner. "Then," exclaimed Neville, impetuously, "the moments that I linger here will appear to you too many. You will desire that I should be on board already under sail, already arrived. You will wish the man whom I seek should be waiting on the sands when I reach the shore." "He is much nearer," said Falkner calmly. "He is before you, I am he." Neville started. "You, what mean you? You are not Osborne." "I am Rupert Falkner, your mother's destroyer." Neville glanced at Elizabeth. His eye met hers. Their thought was the same, that this declaration proceeded from insanity. The fire that flashed from Falkner's eyes as he spoke, the sudden crimson that dyed his cheeks, the hollow though subdued tone of his voice, gave warrant for such a suspicion. Elizabeth gazed on him with painful solicitude. "I will not stay one moment longer," continued Falkner. "To pain you by the sight of one so accursed as I, you will hear more from me this very evening. You will hear enough to arrest your voyage, and remember that I shall remain ready to answer any call, to make any reparation, any atonement you may require." He was gone, the door closed. It was as if a dread spectre had vanished, and Neville and Elizabeth looked at each other to read in the face of either whether both were conscious of having been visited by the same vision.